The prison cell is cold. It is the last day. Outside, beyond these stone walls, Athens wakes to ordinary business, merchants opening stalls, fishermen hauling nets, citizens gathering in the agora to argue about taxes and war. Inside, a 70-year-old man sits with his friends, waiting to die. His name is Socrates. In a few hours, he will drink poison. The sentence is legal, voted by 501 of his fellow citizens. The charge, corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing new gods. The real reason, the thing no one will say aloud, is simpler and more dangerous. He asked too many questions. But here, in these final hours, Socrates is not afraid. He is talking, as he always talked, asking his friends about the nature of the soul. Does it survive death? Can we know anything for certain? His wife Xanthippe sits in the corner, weeping. He asks someone to take her home. There is work to do. There are ideas to pursue. Even now, with the hemlock being prepared in the next room, even now he will not stop questioning. This is not a story about a man who died for his beliefs. It is a story about a man whose questions made him so dangerous that an entire democracy decided he had to be silenced. And the question we must answer is this: were they wrong to kill him? Or did Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the city of reason and debate, have legitimate cause to fear what Socrates represented? Everything that follows is an attempt to understand that question. And to understand it, we must go back to before there was a trial, back to before there were accusations, back to when Socrates was simply a citizen of Athens, unremarkable and unknown, living in the shadow of something that would soon crack his world open. Before we continue deeper into this story, I want to ask something of you. If you're finding this exploration meaningful, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It genuinely helps more than you might think. And I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from today? Drop a comment and let me know. I read every single one. Now let us return to Athens, to a time before philosophy became dangerous. Athens in 470 BCE is the center of the world. The Persian invasions have been repelled. The city-state has formed the Delian League, an alliance of Greek cities that is rapidly becoming an Athenian empire. Wealth pours into the city. The Parthenon is being planned. Tragic dramas are performed for tens of thousands in open-air theatres. This is the Athens of Pericles, the Athens that will be remembered as the birthplace of Western civilization. Into this world, Socrates is born. His father, Sophroniscus, is a stonemason, a craftsman. His mother, Phaenarete, is a midwife. They are not wealthy, but they are citizens, which means everything in Athens. It means Socrates will have rights, will own property, will serve in the army, will vote in the assembly. It means he is part of the most radical political experiment in human history. A democracy where power belongs not to kings or priests, but to the citizens themselves. The workshop where young Socrates learns his father's trade sits on the slopes of the Acropolis in the shadow of the great temples under construction. The air is filled with the sound of hammers on stone, the rhythmic tap, tap, tap that marks the passage of hours. Marble dust coats everything, the floor, the tools, Socrates' arms and face. His father, a man of few words and steady hands, teaches him to read the grain of stone, to understand where it will split cleanly and where it will crumble. There is meditation in this work, a kind of focused attention that requires nothing but presence. Young Socrates learns to look at a block of marble and see not what it is, but what it could become. A column, a statue, a step in a temple where citizens will walk for centuries. His father tells him that stone is honest, it does not lie. If you cut poorly, it shows. If you rush, it breaks. The stone teaches patience, precision, respect for the material. These lessons will stay with Socrates long after he abandons the hammer and chisel, the habit of examining things closely, of looking beneath the surface, of asking what something truly is rather than what it appears to be. All of this begins in that workshop, with marble dust in the air and his father's weathered hands guiding his own. But young Socrates also watches his mother work. Phanerete is a midwife, and in Athens this is sacred work, assisting in the most dangerous moment of a woman's life, the transition from pregnancy to motherhood. Socrates sometimes accompanies her on calls, waiting outside while she helps bring new life into the world. He hears the screams, the urgent voices, then finally the cry of the infant. Later, he will describe his own philosophical method as midwifery, not putting ideas into people's heads, but helping them birth ideas they already carry. This metaphor is not accidental. He watched his mother help women through the agony of labor, watched her assess when to intervene and when to let nature work, watched her distinguish true labor from false. And he learned that sometimes the most important thing a helper can do is ask the right questions. Is the pain constant or intermittent? How long since the waters broke? Has the baby moved? So Socrates grows up between stone and flesh, between his father's workshop and his mother's practice, learning two different kinds of attention. One teaches him to see potential in solid matter, the other teaches him to recognize the moment when something hidden is ready to emerge. These are the twin foundations of his later method: the conviction that people contain knowledge they do not know they have, and the patience to help them discover it. We know almost nothing about Socrates' childhood. No letters survive, no diaries, no portraits painted in life. Everything we know about him comes from others, primarily from his students, Plato and Xenophon, who wrote about him after his death. And this creates our first problem. Because Plato's Socrates and Xenophon's Socrates are not quite the same person. Plato gives us a mystical philosopher pursuing ultimate truth. Xenophon gives us a practical moralist concerned with everyday virtue. And there is a third Socrates, the one we find in the comedies of Aristophanes, who is portrayed as a fraudulent intellectual running a school for sophistry. Three Socrateses, all different, all claiming to represent the real man. So we must be careful. We are not reconstructing a life from neutral evidence. We are navigating competing narratives, each shaped by its author's agenda. What we can say with reasonable confidence is this: Socrates learned his father's trade. He worked with stone, with hammer and chisel, shaping marble. He served in the army as a hoplite, a heavy infantryman, which required him to purchase his own armor and weapons. This tells us he had some means, that he was middle class by Athenian standards. He married a woman named Xanthippe, who later sources describe as difficult, shrewish, constantly nagging. His characterization is probably unfair, probably misogynistic, probably the invention of male writers who wanted to portray Socrates as a patient saint. What we know for certain is that they had 3 sons together, and that when Socrates died, those sons were still young. This is the expected trajectory: craftsman, soldier, citizen, father, a decent life in a great city. Socrates should have remained anonymous, one more Athenian among thousands, living and dying without record. But something interrupted this path, something changed him, and the story of what that was begins with a journey to Delphi. According to Plato's account in the Apology, Socrates had a friend named Chaerephon, described as impulsive and devoted. Chaerephon traveled to Delphi, to the oracle of Apollo, the most sacred site in the Greek world. There, the Pythia, the priestess who channeled the god's voice, sat on a tripod over a chasm from which sacred vapors rose. Pilgrims came from across the Mediterranean to ask questions of the oracle. Kings asked about wars, colonists asked where to found cities. Chaerephon asked a different kind of question, He asked, "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" The oracle answered, No one is wiser. When Chaerephon returned and told Socrates what the oracle had said, Socrates was, in his own words, perplexed. He knew the god could not lie, but he also knew he was not wise. He possessed no special knowledge. He had no reputation for learning. How could the oracle's pronouncement be true? And here, in this moment of confusion, Socrates made the decision that would define the rest of his life. He would test the oracle. He would find someone truly wise and bring them to the god as evidence that the oracle was wrong. He would disprove Apollo himself. This is the origin story. This is where philosophy begins, according to Plato. But we must pause here and ask, did this actually happen? The only source for the oracle story is Socrates himself, as reported by Plato decades after the fact. No independent confirmation exists. Some scholars suggest Plato invented the story to give Socrates' mission a divine sanction. Others point out that oracle consultations were expensive, and it seems unlikely that Chaerephon would have wasted one on such a question. Still others argue that even if the consultation happened, Socrates may have retroactively interpreted it to justify behavior he had already adopted. We cannot know the truth. But what matters is not whether the oracle consultation happened. What matters is that Socrates believed he had a divine mission, and that mission was to question. He began with the politicians. Athens was full of men who claimed to be wise, who spoke confidently in the assembly about war and justice and policy. Socrates approached them. He asked them to define what they claimed to understand. What is justice? What is courage? What is virtue? And through careful questioning, through a method of cross-examination that would later be called the elenchus, Socrates demonstrated that these men did not actually know what they claimed to know. Their confidence was based on assumption, on inherited wisdom, on reputation, rather than rigorous thinking. Picture the one such encounter in the agora late afternoon, when the market crowds have thinned and men gather in the colonnades to talk. A prominent politician, let us call him Callicles, though his real name is lost, holds court before a small audience of admirers. He has just delivered a successful speech in the assembly advocating for a new military expedition. He speaks with authority about justice and strength, about Athens' natural right to rule lesser cities. Socrates approaches, barefoot as always, his hymation, the simple cloak Athenians wear, threadbare and dusty. "Excuse me, Callicles," he says, his voice gentle, almost apologetic. "I heard your speech today. It was magnificent, truly. The assembly was moved." Callicles preens, expecting flattery to continue. His admirers lean in, ready to hear their hero praised. "But I confess," Socrates continues, "I did not entirely understand. You spoke much about justice, and I would like to learn from you. What is justice?" The question seems simple. Callicles answers readily. "Justice is giving each person what they deserve. The strong deserve to rule. The weak deserve to obey. This is natural law." "I see," Socrates says, nodding slowly. "And how do we know who is strong and who is weak?" "By their actions, obviously. Some men are born to lead, others to follow." Interesting. So if a group of weak men band together and overpower a strong man, does that make them strong? Callicles hesitates. "That is not what I mean. I speak of natural strength, not mere numbers." "Ah, natural strength. So it is not about actual power, but about something inherent, some quality of soul?" "Yes, exactly." "And this quality, can it be observed, measured? How do we identify it?" Callicles grows irritated. "Any sensible person can see who is fit to rule." "But different people have different opinions about this. Some say the wise should rule, some say the wealthy, some say the well-born, some say those chosen by lot, which is correct. Those who understand politics should rule." "And who understands politics?" "Those fit to rule, of course. So those who should rule are those who should rule. Is that what you are saying?" The audience begins to murmur. They sense what has happened. Callicles has been led in a circle, his confident assertion revealed as mere assertion, unsupported by reasoning. His face reddens. "You are playing word games, Socrates." "Am I? I simply asked you to explain what you meant by justice." "You said it was giving each what they deserve. I asked how we determine what people deserve. You cannot answer without assuming the very thing you are trying to prove. This is not a word game. This is discovering that we do not understand what we thought we understood." Callicles storms off, humiliated. His admirers disperse, some amused, some troubled. Socrates stands alone in the colonnade, looking genuinely puzzled, as if he truly does not understand why people become angry when he asks questions. But he does understand. He knows exactly what he is doing, and he knows the cost. The politicians were not pleased. He moved on to the poets. Surely they were wise. They created beautiful works that moved audiences to tears and laughter. Socrates questioned them about their own creations. What did this line mean? Why did you choose this word? The poets could not answer. They worked by inspiration, by divine possession perhaps, but not by knowledge. They did not understand what they had made. The poets were humiliated. He questioned the craftsmen, the men who worked with their hands as he once had. They at least had genuine knowledge. A shipwright knew how to build ships. A potter knew how to shape clay. But when Socrates pressed them on larger questions, questions of ethics and politics and the good life, they could not answer. And worse, because they had knowledge in their craft, they assumed they had knowledge about everything. Their partial wisdom made them more foolish, not less. With each such conversation, Socrates refined his method. He would approach someone with a reputation for wisdom. He would profess ignorance and ask for instruction. The person would offer a definition or claim. Socrates would ask clarifying questions. Through these questions, contradictions would emerge. The person would revise their claim. More questions would reveal more contradictions. Eventually, the person would be forced to admit they did not know what they thought they knew. This method, later called the elenchus or Socratic method, was devastatingly effective, but it was also deeply alienating. Because people do not like discovering they are ignorant, especially not publicly, especially not in front of students and peers. Each successful elenchus made an enemy, and there were many successful elenchi. And through all this questioning, Socrates came to understand what the oracle meant. He was wisest not because he knew more than others, but because he alone knew that he knew nothing. He had examined himself and found ignorance. The politicians, poets, and craftsmen had not. They lived in false certainty. He lived in true aporia, in acknowledged confusion. But there was a cost to this realization. With each conversation, Socrates made enemies. The men he questioned were the powerful and the prominent. They had reputations to maintain. They had students who paid them for wisdom. And here was this strange, barefoot man with a snub nose and bulging eyes, asking them simple questions that revealed their pretensions as hollow. They hated him for it. And their sons, the young men of Athens who followed Socrates around and watched him humiliate their elders, began to imitate his method. They began asking the same questions, exposing the same ignorance. This is what is meant by corrupting the youth. It did not mean teaching them vice, it meant teaching them to question their fathers. By the time Socrates is 40, he has become a figure. Not famous exactly, but known. People point him out in the Agora. The comic playwrights mock him. In 423 BCE, Aristophanes produces a play called The Clouds, in which Socrates is portrayed as running a thinkery, a school where young men learn to make the worse argument appear the better. In the play, Socrates is shown suspended in a basket, contemplating the sun and the clouds, teaching atheism and sophistry, It is savage satire. It is also notably wildly inaccurate. Plato's Socrates never cared about natural philosophy, never charged money for teaching, never claimed to make weak arguments strong. But the satire stuck. For decades afterward, Athenians who knew nothing else about Socrates knew him as the eccentric in the basket, the professional question-asker who made young men disrespect their elders. But Aristophanes' Socrates is a fiction. So is Plato's Socrates in a different way. So is Xenophon's. The real Socrates, if we can even speak of such a thing, existed in the gap between these representations. And what we find in that gap is not a serene sage, but a complicated, contradictory man navigating a city that is about to tear itself apart. Because while Socrates was questioning the Athenians, Athens was destroying itself in war. The Peloponnesian War began in 431 BCE. On one side, Athens and its empire. On the other, Sparta and its allies. The war would last 27 years and end with Athens in ruins. But in the early years, no one knew how it would go. Pericles, the greatest leader Athens had known, advocated a defensive strategy. The Athenians would withdraw behind their walls and let the Spartans ravage the countryside. Athens controlled the sea. Athens could be supplied by ships. They would outlast Sparta's agricultural economy. The strategy might have worked, but in 430 BCE a plague struck Athens. The disease came from the east, brought by ships carrying grain from Egypt. Packed inside the city walls with no way to escape, the Athenians died in thousands. The symptoms were horrific. Fever, lesions, internal burning, bodies piled in the streets. Traditional burial became impossible. People died in temples where they had gone seeking healing. The social fabric unraveled. People stopped obeying laws, stopped believing in the gods, stopped caring about reputation, because they expected to die anyway. Socrates walked through these streets. He saw bodies stacked outside homes, waiting for the carts that would carry them to mass graves. He heard the wailing of the bereaved, the prayers of the desperate, the silence that fell when people had no more strength even to grieve. The city smelled of death, the sweet, corrupt odor of decaying flesh that no amount of incense could mask. In the agora, where he used to question politicians about justice, now people fought over scraps of food. The wealthy barricaded themselves in their homes, the poor died in the streets, and the plague made no distinctions. It took the just and the unjust, the pious and the skeptical, the young and the old. What did Socrates make of this? Did it shake his faith in the gods? Did it make him question whether there was any order, any justice in the cosmos? We have no record of his thoughts during the plague, but we know he survived it. And we know that afterward, when the city was trying to rebuild, trying to restore some sense of meaning and order, Socrates was still there, still asking his questions, but now his questions had a different weight. Before the plague, debates about virtue and justice were intellectual exercises, games played by comfortable men in a prosperous city. After the plague, after watching thousands die senselessly, those questions became urgent. How should we live? What makes life worth living? What do we owe each other? These were no longer abstract puzzles. They were matters of survival. Pericles himself caught the plague. In 429 BCE, he died. With him died the guiding intelligence of Athenian strategy. The war would continue for another 25 years, but it would become increasingly desperate, increasingly brutal, increasingly detached from rational policy. Socrates lived through this. He was alive when the plague turned Athens into a mass grave. He saw the breakdown of civic order, the erosion of moral restraint, and we can only wonder what effect this had on a man whose mission was to make Athenians care about virtue. When people expect to die tomorrow, why should they care about justice today? When the gods allow this kind of suffering, Why should anyone believe in divine justice? Socrates never wrote down his thoughts about the plague, but he lived through it, and it shaped the Athens he would spend the rest of his life trying to reform. If the city could be reformed, if asking questions could change anything, if philosophy could stand against the forces of empire and war and mass death. These are the questions Socrates did not yet know he should be asking, but they were coming. And they would be delivered by a man whose beauty was legendary, whose intelligence was formidable, and whose betrayal would help destroy Athens. His name was Alcibiades. Alcibiades enters the story in 432 BCE, when Socrates is approximately 40. The context is military. Athens has sent an expedition to Potidæa, a city in Thrace that had rebelled against Athenian control. Socrates served as a hoplite in this campaign. Heavy infantry warfare in ancient Greece was intimate and terrifying. Men stood shoulder to shoulder in formation, shields overlapping, spears extending forward. When the lines clashed, it was push and shove and thrust, chaos and screaming and blood. The Athenians won the battle, but it was close. During the fighting, a young cavalry officer named Alcibiades was wounded and surrounded. It would have been killed, but Socrates, fighting nearby, held the line and protected him until the danger passed. Alcibiades later said that Socrates saved his life. This moment, this instant when Socrates stood between a wounded aristocrat and enemy spears, created a bond that would define both men's lives. Alcibiades was perhaps 18, beautiful beyond description, his face unmarked by battle, his body sculpted like the statues in the temples. He came from one of Athens's most aristocratic families, the Alcmaeonidae, descended from the ancient kings of Athens. Money, beauty, intelligence, family, he had everything. And he had just been saved by a middle-aged stonemason philosopher with a snub nose and bulging eyes, a man who walked barefoot and wore the same threadbare cloak year-round. Alcibiades could not make sense of it. Why had Socrates risked his life for someone he barely knew? What did this strange man want? Most people wanted something from Alcibiades, his influence, his money, his body. But when he approached Socrates after the battle to offer thanks, Socrates seemed almost indifferent to gratitude. "You fought well," Socrates said simply. "You will make a good soldier." "I fought recklessly," Alcibiades admitted. "I should have been killed." "Should have, but you were not. Perhaps the gods have plans for you. Or perhaps I was lucky." Socrates smiled, that infuriating half-smile that never quite revealed what he was thinking. Is luck different from divine will? How do we distinguish them? And just like that, the conversation stopped being about gratitude and became about philosophy. Alcibiades found himself trying to define luck, then divine intervention, then fate, and discovering that he could not coherently explain any of them. He became frustrated, then intrigued. Who was this man who could not be impressed by beauty or breeding, who seemed to want nothing except to ask questions? This is our first real glimpse of Socrates at war. Later sources emphasize his extraordinary endurance, his ability to walk barefoot through snow, to stand motionless for hours in meditation, to remain calm in battle when others panicked. At the Battle of Delium in 424 BCE, when the Athenian army broke and fled, Socrates retreated slowly and deliberately, turning frequently to face the enemy, giving the appearance of a man who would fight if pursued. This bearing, witnesses said, probably saved his life. Soldiers knew that attacking a man who was willing to stand and fight even in retreat was dangerous. So Socrates was brave, unusually brave. This matters because later, when he is accused of corrupting youth and impiety, his courage cannot be questioned. He has stood in the phalanx. He has faced death for Athens. Whatever his critics may say about his philosophy, they cannot say he is a coward or unpatriotic. But back to Alcibiades. The young man whose life Socrates saved was extraordinary by any measure. He was stunningly beautiful, from one of Athens' most aristocratic families, brilliant in speech, charming, ambitious. He was also wildly unstable. Alcibiades attached himself to Socrates. He became, if not exactly a student, then an admirer, a companion. The relationship deepened over years. Alcibiades would seek Socrates out in the agora, would invite him to symposia, the drinking parties where Athenian men reclined on couches, wine mixed with water, conversation flowing. At these gatherings, Alcibiades performed. He was always performing, always aware of his effect on others, always testing to see who would be charmed and who would be challenged. But Socrates refused to be charmed in the expected way. When Alcibiades praised him, Socrates deflected. When Alcibiades tried to engage him in the elaborate flirtations that characterized Athenian homoerotic culture, Socrates responded with questions. What is beauty? What is love? What is desire? Is it directed at bodies or souls? And is bodily beauty more or less real than the beauty of a virtuous character? These questions frustrated and fascinated Alcibiades in equal measure. He was used to being the pursuer, the one whose beauty gave him power, but Socrates inverted the dynamic. He suggested that Alcibiades, for all his physical perfection, was spiritually incomplete, that his soul needed formation, that beauty without wisdom was hollow. The relationship was complicated. In Athens, it was culturally acceptable, even expected, for older men to form romantic relationships with adolescent boys. These relationships were supposed to be educational, the older man serving as mentor and lover, guiding the younger toward virtue. Plato's Symposium suggests that Alcibiades tried to seduce Socrates and was rejected. Socrates wanted to form Alcibiades' soul, not his body. In the Symposium, Plato stages a remarkable scene. Alcibiades arrives late at the drinking party, drunk and crowned with ivy. He proceeds to give a speech in praise of Socrates, but it is a strange praise, full of resentment and admiration mixed. He describes how he tried to be alone with Socrates, how he waited for Socrates to make advances, how nothing happened. I thought I was doing him a favor, Alcibiades says, sharing my beauty with him, but he disdained it. He treated my beauty as worthless. Then Alcibiades describes Socrates' extraordinary nature, how he can drink without getting drunk, how he stands motionless in thought for an entire day, how he saved Alcibiades' life in battle, then insisted the military honor go to Alcibiades rather than himself, how he is like no one else, ancient or modern, a man utterly unique. He is like a satyr statue, Alcibiades says, ugly on the outside but containing gods within. Whether this actually happened or is Plato's invention, we cannot know. What we do know is that Socrates and Alcibiades were close for years, and that this association would later be used against Socrates when Alcibiades became the most hated man in Athens. Because Alcibiades, for all his brilliance, was a disaster, he became a leading politician while still young. He advocated for aggressive expansion, for the conquest of Sicily. In 415 BCE, Athens launched the Sicilian expedition, the largest military operation in Greek history. Nearly the entire Athenian fleet sailed west, carrying thousands of hoplites and cavalry, intent on conquering Syracuse and dominating the western Mediterranean. Alcibiades was one of the commanders, but on the night before the fleet sailed, someone vandalized the Hermes throughout Athens. Hermes were stone pillars topped with the head of Hermes and featuring an erect phallus. They stood at doorways and crossroads throughout the city, and in a single night, someone smashed the faces and genitals of most of them. It was sacrilege. It was also, many believed, an omen of disaster. Alcibiades was accused of involvement. He was also accused of profaning the Eleusinian mysteries, the most sacred religious rites in Athens, by performing a drunken parody of them at a private party. He demanded an immediate trial, wanting to clear his name before the fleet sailed, but his political enemies delayed. They let the fleet leave with him aboard, knowing they could recall him later. And they did. Halfway to Sicily, Alcibiades was ordered to return to Athens to stand trial. Instead, he fled. He defected to Sparta, and he advised the Spartans on how to defeat Athens. The Sicilian expedition ended in complete catastrophe. Nearly the entire Athenian force was destroyed. Thousands of men died in battle or were enslaved in Syracusan quarries. Athens never fully recovered. And Alcibiades, the man who had pushed for the expedition and then betrayed Athens to its enemies, became the symbol of aristocratic treachery. And people remembered that Alcibiades had been close to Socrates, that Socrates had saved his life, that Socrates had spent years in his company. What had Socrates taught him? What kind of education produces a traitor? In the taverns and workshops, in the assembly and the law courts, the whispers began. Socrates and Alcibiades, the ugly philosopher and the beautiful traitor, the man who asked questions and the man who betrayed Athens. Was there a connection? Had Socrates' teaching somehow produced this disaster? There was no evidence of direct causation. Socrates never taught Alcibiades to betray Athens, but he had taught him to question, to think for himself, to value truth over convention, and perhaps this was the fear, perhaps that kind of teaching led naturally to disloyalty. If you teach young men to question everything, to reject tradition, to value their own judgment over the city's wisdom, where does that lead? It leads to Alcibiades. It leads to betrayal. This is the beginning of the case against Socrates. Not a legal case yet, but a narrative, a suspicion. Socrates asked questions that undermine traditional beliefs. He surrounded himself with aristocratic young men, and those young men became enemies of democracy, because Alcibiades was not the only one. There was another student, another aristocrat, another man associated with Socrates who would betray Athens. His name was Critias, and he would do something worse than defect to Sparta. He would rule Athens as a tyrant. By 404 BCE, the Peloponnesian War is in its final year. Athens is starving. The Spartan general Lysander has blockaded Piraeus, the port through which the city's food arrives. The Athenian fleet, which had sustained the empire and defended the democracy, has been destroyed at the Battle of Aegospotami. There is no food coming in, there is no navy to protect the trade routes, there is no money to hire mercenaries. Athens is defeated. The only question is, what terms Sparta will impose. The Spartans could have destroyed Athens, they could have torn down the walls, sold the population into slavery, turned the city into a subject state. Some of Sparta's allies advocated exactly this, but Sparta demurred. Athens would be spared, but it would be transformed. The democracy would be dissolved. A new government would be installed, one friendly to Sparta, one that would ensure Athens never threatened Spartan interests again. This government became known as the 30 Tyrants. They were oligarchs, aristocrats, who believed that democracy had ruined Athens, that the common people were unfit to rule. They believed that power should belong to the educated few, the kaloi kagathoi, the beautiful and good. And their leader, the most intelligent and most ruthless among them, was Critias. Critias had spent time with Socrates. Ancient sources list him among Socrates' companions. Whether he was a formal student is debated, but he moved in Socrates' circle. He was a poet, a philosopher, a man who thought deeply about politics and virtue. And when he seized power in 404 BCE, he set about restructuring Athens according to his vision. The 30 began by arresting and executing the sycophants, the professional prosecutors, who had made a living bringing charges against wealthy citizens. This was popular. The sycophants were hated. But the executions did not stop there. The 30 moved against anyone suspected of supporting democracy. They drew up lists. They sent armed men to arrest citizens in the night. They confiscated property to enrich themselves and pay their Spartan backers. Within months, they had killed 1,500 Athenian citizens. There were no trials, no due process, just accusation and execution. One of the most notorious cases involved a man named Leon of Salamis. Leon was a wealthy metic, a foreign resident living in Athens. The 30 wanted his money, so they ordered his arrest and execution, but they needed citizens to carry out the arrest, to give it a veneer of legality. They summoned 5 men to the tholos, the circular building where the executive committee met. They gave the 5 men orders: go to Salamis, arrest Leon, bring him back to Athens to be executed. 4 of the men obeyed, 1 refused. That man was Socrates. The tholos was dim, lit by oil lamps that cast flickering shadows on the curved walls. The 30 sat in a semicircle, Critias at the center. Socrates stood before them with 4 other citizens, all of them knowing that refusal meant death. Critias explained the mission in measured tones. Leon of Salamis was an enemy of the new order. He possessed wealth that rightfully belonged to the state. He needed to be brought to Athens to answer charges. It was a simple task, a civic duty. The other 4 men nodded. They would obey. They had families. They had survival to think about. Critias looked at Socrates. You understand what is required? Socrates met his gaze. This man had once sat in the agora listening to Socrates question politicians about justice. This man had discussed the nature of virtue, had claimed to care about truth. Now he sat in power, ordering murders. I understand what you are asking, Socrates said quietly, and I will not do it. The room went silent. The other 4 men stared at Socrates in horror. Did he not understand the danger? Did he not value his life? Critias' face hardened. You refuse a direct order from the legitimate government of Athens. I refuse to participate in murder. Whether the government is legitimate is another question. You risk your life for a man you do not know? I risk my life to avoid becoming a murderer. That is not for Leon's sake. It is for my own. Critias leaned forward. You taught me, Socrates, that the philosopher must be willing to do what is necessary for the good of the city. The city requires stability. Stability requires removing threats. This is logic. This is reason. I taught you to question, Socrates said. I taught you to examine whether what seems necessary is truly necessary, whether what seems good is truly good. You learned the method, but not the purpose. The purpose is truth. The purpose is virtue, and virtue does not include killing innocent men for their money. For a moment, it seemed Critias might order Socrates arrested on the spot. But he did not. Perhaps he still felt some residual respect for his old teacher. Perhaps he calculated that killing Socrates would create a martyr. Or perhaps, despite everything, some small part of him wondered if Socrates was right. Go home, Socrates, Critias said finally. But know that your refusal is noted. Socrates turned and walked out into the night. He did not warn Leon. He did not try to help him escape. He simply went home and waited to see if the 30 would come for him. They did not. Leon was arrested by the other 4 men and executed. And Socrates survived, not through heroism, but through luck. Because within weeks the 30's rule collapsed. We know this happened because Socrates mentions it in the Apology. He refused the order. He went home instead. He did nothing to help Leon, nothing to warn him, but he did not participate, and he knew, he says, that he might be executed for this refusal. The only reason he survived was that the 30's rule collapsed soon afterward, because the oligarchy was unsustainable. They had no popular support. They relied entirely on Spartan backing and internal terror. Within 8 months, democratic exiles marched on Athens from their base in Thebes. Street fighting erupted. Critias was killed in the battle. the 30 fell, and in 403 BCE democracy was restored. But the restoration came with a condition: amnesty. All crimes committed during the war and under the oligarchy would be forgiven, no prosecutions for past political actions. This was necessary to prevent endless cycles of revenge, but it meant that the Democrats could not prosecute Socrates for his association with Critias and Alcibiades. They could not put him on trial for the students he had taught, the oligarchs he had conversed with, the aristocratic young men whose anti-democratic views he had perhaps encouraged. They had to find another charge, a charge that was not technically political but that everyone would understand was political, a charge that would allow the people of Athens to render judgment on the man they believed had helped destroy their city. The charge they chose was impiety. Socrates did not believe in the gods of Athens. Socrates introduced new divinities. Socrates corrupted the youth. These were the formal accusations. The real accusation, the one that could not be spoken under the amnesty but that everyone understood, was this: Socrates taught the men who had betrayed and brutalized Athens. He was responsible, and now, finally, he would answer for it. In 399 BCE, 4 years after the restoration of democracy, 3 men bring formal charges against Socrates. Their names are Meletus, Anytus, and Lycon. The primary accuser is Meletus, a young religious poet. But everyone knows the real power behind the prosecution is Anytus, a wealthy tanner and democratic politician. Anytus lost his own son to Socrates' influence. The son rejected his father's trade, rejected the values of his class, became enamored with philosophy. Anytus blamed Socrates. He wanted revenge. But more than personal revenge, he wanted to send a message. Athens would not tolerate those who undermined its democracy, who turned sons against fathers, who questioned the foundations of civic life. The procedure is formal. Socrates must appear before the Basilius Archon, the magistrate responsible for religious matters. The charges are read. Socrates is given time to prepare a defense. Then, on the appointed day, he will stand before a jury of 501 citizens drawn by lot from the Athenian population. They will hear the prosecution's case. They will hear Socrates' defense. Then they will vote. A simple majority determines guilt or innocence. This is Athenian justice. No professional judges, no lawyers, no appeals, just citizens rendering judgment on one of their own. The trial takes place in the Royal Stoa, a colonnaded building in the northwest corner of the Agora. It is a warm day. The jury sits in sections. Socrates stands in the center. He is 70 years old. His friends surround him, offering support. But Plato, his most devoted student, is absent. Ill, the sources say, or perhaps unable to bear witnessing what is about to happen. The Royal Stoa is crowded. 501 jurors fill the benches, a mass of faces that represents Athens itself. Merchants and farmers, craftsmen and soldiers, young men and old, all citizens, all with the power to decide whether Socrates will live or die. The air is hot, thick with breath and sweat. Flies buzz near the oil lamps. Outside, the normal business of the agora continues, vendors calling prices, children running between the stalls, the rhythmic clang of a blacksmith's hammer. Inside, history is about to change. Socrates stands in a small, clear space in the center. He wears a simple himation, no different from what he wears every day. His feet are bare. His face, with its distinctive snub nose and wide-set eyes, is calm. He does not look like a man on trial for his life. He looks like a man about to have an interesting conversation. The water clock is set. This is how time is measured in Athenian trials. A vessel with a small hole in the bottom, water draining slowly. When the water runs out, the speaker's time is up. The prosecution has the first clock. Meletus speaks first. The prosecution has limited time measured by a water clock. He presents the charges. Socrates does not believe in the gods whom the city believes in. He introduces new divine powers. He corrupts the young men who associate with him. These crimes undermine the foundations of Athens. If allowed to continue, they will destroy the city's relationship with the gods, will turn the young against their elders, will dissolve the bonds of civic trust. Athens has survived war and plague and tyranny. It cannot survive a man who teaches the young to despise everything their ancestors held sacred. Meletus's rhetoric is effective. He invokes the recent past without explicitly mentioning what he cannot mention under the amnesty. Everyone in the room knows that Socrates' students included traitors and tyrants. Everyone knows that Alcibiades and Critias spent time learning from this man. The unspoken argument is simple. Look at what Socrates' education produces. Look at the men he formed. They destroyed Athens. Now Athens must destroy him. But then Meletus makes specific claims. He says Socrates teaches atheism, that Socrates denies the gods entirely. He says Socrates accepts money for teaching, running a school like the sophists. He says Socrates deliberately corrupts the young, intentionally making them worse citizens. These claims are rhetorically powerful but factually vulnerable, and Socrates knows it. When Meletus finishes, it is Socrates' turn. And here we must confront a mystery. What did Socrates actually say in his defense? We have Plato's Apology, which purports to be Socrates' speech. We also have Xenophon's Apology, which gives a different version. The two accounts agree on broad outlines but differ in detail, tone, and emphasis. Scholars debate how much is historical record and how much is literary invention. Plato wrote the Apology years after the trial. He was not present. He was recreating from memory and testimony, shaped by his own philosophical agenda, his own grief, his own desire to immortalize his teacher. What we can say is that Socrates did not beg for mercy. He did not appeal to emotion. He did not bring his sons forward to weep and plead for their father's life, though this was common practice in Athenian trials. Instead, according to Plato, he interrogated his accusers. He used the very method that had made him hated. He asked questions. Socrates approaches the center of the floor. He looks at Meletus, young and nervous now that his rhetoric has ended, and he must face questioning. Meletus, Socrates begins, his voice carrying easily in the columned space. You say I corrupt the youth. This is a serious charge. Tell me, do I corrupt them intentionally or unintentionally? Meletus swallows. Intentionally, of course. You deliberately make them worse. I see, but consider. If I make the citizens around me worse, they will harm me, will they not? Bad people harm those near them. I suppose so. Then why would I deliberately make people worse, knowing they will harm me? That would be irrational.
No one deliberately harms themselves. You do it anyway? So you claim I am wise enough to be a teacher, but foolish enough to harm myself deliberately? Which is it, Meletus? Am I clever or stupid? The jury murmurs. Some are amused, some are annoyed. Socrates is doing it again, asking questions, making his accuser look foolish. And you say, I do not believe in the gods.
But I swear by the gods, do I not? I speak of my daimonion, my divine sign. In your own indictment you say I introduce new divine powers. How can I introduce divine powers if I do not believe in the divine? Do you believe in musical things, but not in musicians? In horse-related things, but not in horses? Meletus stammers. The argument is too quick, too clever. He cannot keep up. You have not thought about these charges carefully, Socrates says almost gently. You have brought an indictment without examining what it means. This is exactly the problem I have spent my life addressing. People make claims without understanding them. They speak with confidence about things they have not examined. Do I not believe in the gods? But I swear by the gods. I speak of my daimonion, my divine sign. How can I believe in divine signs but not in the divine? The arguments are clever. Too clever. This is not the speech of a man trying to win acquittal. This is the speech of a man performing philosophy one last time, demonstrating that the unexamined life is not worth living, showing that he will not compromise his method even to save his life. And then Socrates makes it worse. He says that far from deserving punishment, he deserves to be fed at public expense in the Prytaneum, the highest honor Athens can bestow, reserved for Olympic victors and public benefactors. I have spent my life trying to make you better, he tells the jury. I have gone to each of you like a father or older brother, urging you to care about virtue. I have never charged money. I have neglected my own affairs to pursue this service. If anyone deserves public maintenance, it is I. The jury reacts audibly now, gasps, angry mutters. Who does this man think he is? He stands accused of corrupting the youth, and he demands the highest honor Athens can give. But Socrates continues, his voice steady, almost conversational. I am not being arrogant.
I am being truthful. You want me to propose exile, do you not? You want me to stop teaching, to leave Athens, to make this problem go away. But I cannot do that. If I say that the greatest good for a human being is to discuss virtue every day, to examine myself and others, if I say this is what makes life worth living, then how can I propose to stop doing it?
You would not believe me if I said I would be silent, and I cannot be silent, so I will not propose exile. And this is what dooms him, because the jury does not want philosophical arguments. They want contrition. They want acknowledgement that Socrates has done something wrong, that he will stop, that he poses no further threat. Instead, Socrates doubles down. He says that far from deserving punishment, he deserves to be fed at public expense in the Prytaneum, the highest honor Athens can bestow, reserved for Olympic victors and public benefactors. He has spent his life improving the Athenians, he says, trying to make them care about virtue instead of wealth and reputation. He is Athens' greatest gift to itself. The jury votes guilty. The margin is closer than expected, approximately 280 to 220. If just 30 jurors had voted differently, Socrates would have been acquitted. But now comes the second phase of the trial. Under Athenian law, there is no fixed penalty. The prosecution proposes a penalty, in this case, death. The defense proposes a counter-penalty. Then the jury votes again, choosing between the two proposals. This is Socrates' chance. If he proposes exile, the jury will likely accept it. Exile was a common penalty for serious crimes. It would remove Socrates from Athens, satisfy the demand for punishment, but spare his life. Everyone expects him to propose exile. Everyone believes this is the compromise that will end the trial. His friends urge him. Crito, wealthy and pragmatic, whispers urgently. Propose exile. They will accept it. You will live. Socrates shakes his head. Exile is a kind of death. I cannot practice philosophy anywhere but Athens. These are my people. This is my city. To leave would be to abandon my mission. Your mission will end anyway if you are executed. No, it will end if I abandon it. Execution is something done to me. Exile would be something I choose. I will not choose to stop. Socrates refuses. He will not leave Athens. He proposes a small fine instead, 1 mina, later increased to 30 minas when his friends offer to pay. The jury is insulted. They have voted that this man deserves significant punishment. He offers pocket change. They vote again. This time, the margin is wider. Death. execution by hemlock poisoning, to be carried out within days. After the verdict is announced, Socrates asks to speak once more. The jury technically could refuse, but they are curious. What will he say now that he is condemned? Socrates' voice is calm, perhaps calmer than it has been throughout the trial. You have condemned me to death, but I want you to understand what you have done. You think you are silencing me, but you are making me immortal. Ideas cannot be killed. Questions cannot be executed. You will drink your wine and go home and try to forget this day. But you will not forget. Because what I represent, the examined life, the commitment to truth, the refusal to accept comfortable lies, this cannot die. It will haunt you. It will haunt Athens. It will outlive all of us. Some jurors look troubled, others angry. A few seem genuinely stricken, as if realizing for the first time what they have done. I am not afraid of death, Socrates continues. Death is either dreamless sleep or a journey to another place where I can question the great heroes of old. Either way, it is not evil. But you must live with what you have decided today. And I wonder if that will be easier or harder than what awaits me. Why did Socrates do this? Why did he refuse to save himself when salvation was offered? This is the most debated question in the entire trial. Some argue that Socrates was making a philosophical point, that exile would be a kind of death anyway because he could not practice philosophy anywhere but Athens. Xenophon suggests Socrates welcomed death because he was old and wanted to die while his mind was still sharp. Others suggest that Socrates genuinely believed the jury would acquit him on the penalty vote and was shocked when they did not. But there is another possibility. Socrates had devoted his entire adult life to making Athenians care about virtue. He had questioned everyone who claimed to be wise. He had served the god by exposing false certainty. And now Athens was telling him to stop, to go into exile, to cease being who he was. To accept exile would be to admit that he had been wrong, that his mission was invalid, that philosophy should yield to politics. He could not do that. Philosophy is not something a person does. It is something a person is. To stop asking questions would be to die spiritually even if he lived physically. Better to die physically while remaining true to his mission. Better to become a martyr for the examined life than a living compromise. This is what Plato wants us to believe, but we must be suspicious of Plato, because Plato was not just reporting what happened, he was creating a legacy. He was transforming his teacher's execution into philosophy's founding sacrifice. The moment when it became clear that the city and the philosopher could not coexist, that truth and power were fundamentally opposed. But what if the truth is more complicated? What if Athens had legitimate reasons to fear Socrates? What if this was not philosophy versus power, but two incompatible visions of how a community should be organized? Let us consider the case against Socrates more carefully. Not the formal charges, which are clearly pretext, but the real grievances. Socrates claimed to know nothing, yet he questioned everyone. He professed humility, yet he compared himself to a gadfly sent by the god to sting the lazy horse of Athens. He said he wanted to make people better, yet his method was to humiliate them publicly, to expose their ignorance in front of their students and peers. He said he taught no one, yet young men flocked to him and learned to imitate his questioning. He claimed to support the law, yet he defied both the democracy and the oligarchy when they commanded him to do things he considered unjust. From a democratic perspective, this is dangerous. Democracy requires that citizens accept collective decisions even when they disagree. Democracy requires trust in the wisdom of the many over the supposed wisdom of the few. Democracy requires that education supports civic virtues rather than undermine them. Socrates did the opposite. He elevated individual judgment over collective decision. He suggested that the many were ignorant, and only the few who had examined themselves could be truly virtuous. He taught the sons of the elite to question their fathers, to reject traditional authorities, to value logical argument over democratic consensus, and the results were visible. Alcibiades had been close to Socrates. Alcibiades betrayed Athens. Critias had been close to Socrates. Critias terrorized Athens. Charmides, another oligarch who died fighting for the 30, had been Socrates' companion. The pattern was clear. Socrates' associates became traitors. Now correlation is not causation. We cannot know what Alcibiades or Critias would have become without Socrates' influence. Perhaps they were always going to be who they became. Perhaps Socrates even moderated their worst impulses. We have no way of knowing. But from the perspective of democratic Athens in 399 BCE, the pattern was damning. This man's philosophy produced enemies of the people. Whatever his intentions, the practical result of his teaching was the destruction of democracy. And there was another concern, one that is hard for modern people to grasp. The charge of impiety was not merely about belief, it was about civic participation. Athenian religion was not like later monotheisms. It did not primarily concern personal faith or individual salvation. It was about communal rituals that bound the city together, sacrifices to Athena on the Acropolis, processions to Eleusis for the mysteries, dramatic competitions during the festival of Dionysus. These rituals created collective identity. They reminded Athenians that they were one people, united under the protection of the gods. Socrates participated in these rituals, but he spoke of a daimonion, a personal divine sign that warned him away from certain actions. This was unusual, potentially threatening. If everyone claims to have a personal divine voice, what happens to communal religion? If individuals can appeal to private revelation, what prevents religious chaos? The charge that Socrates introduced new divinities was not absurd. He did speak of divine guidance in ways that seemed to bypass or transcend traditional civic religion. From this perspective, the trial of Socrates was not about suppressing free thought. It was about defending the cohesion of a political community that had barely survived tyranny and war. It was about a democracy protecting itself from an ideology that, whatever its philosophical merits, had proven practically dangerous. This is the hard truth that gets obscured in triumphalist narratives about philosophy versus power. Democracy is fragile. It depends on citizens trusting each other, trusting the process, accepting that they will sometimes be outvoted and must abide by decisions they oppose. It depends on shared values, shared rituals, shared stories about who the people are. And Socrates, intentionally or not, undermined all of this. He taught elite young men to trust individual reason over collective wisdom. He taught them that the unexamined life was not worth living, which implies that most lives are not worth living. He taught them that virtue could not be learned from the city, but only from rigorous philosophical inquiry. The Athenians were not stupid. They were not a mob. They were citizens of the most successful democracy in human history, a city that had defeated the Persian Empire, built the Parthenon, produced Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides, and they looked at Socrates and saw a threat, not a threat to a particular politician or policy, a threat to the entire democratic project. Were they right? This is the question we must sit with, because if they were right, if Socrates' philosophy was genuinely incompatible with democratic life, then the trial was not a martyrdom, but a tragedy. Two goods in conflict, unable to coexist. Athens needed unity and Socrates offered questioning. Athens needed citizens to accept authority and Socrates taught them to doubt it. Athens needed to move forward collectively and Socrates kept pulling everyone back to examine first principles. Something had to give, and in 399 BCE, what gave was Socrates. After the verdict, Socrates is not immediately executed. Athenian law requires a delay. A sacred ship has been sent to Delos to honor Apollo, and no executions can occur until the ship returns. This delay lasts 30 days. Socrates spends them in prison, chained at the ankle, receiving visits from his friends. The prison is a simple stone building near the agora. Socrates' cell is small, perhaps 12 feet square, with a single high window that admits light but no view. A wooden bench serves as bed. His ankle is bound with an iron cuff attached to a ring in the wall, giving him enough chain to move about the cell but not to leave it. The guards are apologetic. They know Socrates. Everyone in Athens knows Socrates. They bring him better food than the standard prison fare. They allow his friends to visit at unusual hours. They pretend not to notice when Crito comes before dawn to discuss escape plans. During these 30 days, Socrates' cell becomes a kind of school, perhaps the most famous classroom in history. His friends come daily. They sit on the floor, on the bench, leaning against the walls. And Socrates talks not about his fate, not about the injustice of the verdict, but about ideas, about the soul, about virtue, about death. It is during this period that the conversation recorded in Plato's Crito takes place. Crito, Socrates' wealthy friend, comes to the prison before dawn. He has arranged everything. He has bribed the guards. A ship is waiting in Piraeus. Socrates can escape to Thessaly, where he will be welcomed. It is the obvious thing to do. The vote was close. The charges were political. Even many of those who voted for death probably expected Socrates to flee. Exile was honorable. Remaining to die served no purpose. The cell is dark. Dawn is still an hour away. Crito sits beside Socrates on the narrow bench. His voice is urgent, pleading. Everything is ready. The guards are bribed. We leave before sunrise. You will be in Thessaly before Athens knows you are gone. Socrates is quiet for a long moment. When he speaks, his voice is gentle, almost sad. Crito, you are a good friend, but I cannot do what you ask. Why not? The trial was unjust. The verdict was political. No one will blame you for escaping. Will I blame myself? For saving your life? Of course not. For breaking the law? For undermining the very legal system I have always said must be obeyed? Socrates refuses. He asks Crito to imagine that the laws of Athens have come alive, that they are standing before him as persons, asking why he thinks he can disobey them. Has Athens wronged him? Did it not educate him, protect him, allow him to flourish? If he disagreed with Athens' laws, he was free to leave. He stayed. By staying, he entered into a covenant. He agreed to abide by Athens' decisions, even when those decisions went against him. To flee now would be to break that covenant. It would be to admit that he only respected the law when it served his interests. Imagine, Socrates says, that the laws themselves could speak. What would they say to me? They would say, Socrates, you have lived 70 years under our protection. You raised your children here. You fought in our wars. You never once tried to leave, though you were free to do so. And now, when our verdict goes against you, you would break us. You would teach every Athenian that laws can be ignored when inconvenient. The laws are not asking you to die, Crito protests. Unjust men are asking you to die. But the laws created the system that convicted me. If I obey the laws only when they produce results I approve, then I do not truly obey them at all. The argument is powerful but also strange, because Socrates had disobeyed Athens before. He refused to arrest Leon of Salamis. He refused to participate in the illegal condemnation of the Arginussae generals. His obedience to law was conditional, limited by his conscience. Why is this case different? Perhaps because those earlier acts of disobedience were refusals to do injustice. He would not help the 30 murder Leon. He would not participate in an illegal trial, but to escape from prison would be to do injustice. It would be to harm Athens by suggesting that its legal system could be ignored when inconvenient. The distinction is subtle but crucial. Socrates will not obey commands to commit injustice, but he will accept punishment rather than undermine the rule of law itself. Or perhaps, as some scholars suggest, Socrates wanted to die. He was 70 years old. He had lost his city's respect. His students had become hated. His life's work had not reformed Athens, but rather convinced Athens that he was dangerous. What was left? To grow old in exile, a failed philosopher begging for support in foreign cities? Or to die in Athens, making his death mean something, transforming a legal execution into a philosophical act? Crito tries one more time. Think of your sons. They will grow up without a father. Is that justice? Socrates looks toward the high window where the first grey light of dawn is beginning to show. My sons will grow up knowing their father died for what he believed. That is worth more than a living coward. You are not a coward. You are being stubborn. Perhaps, but I am being consistently stubborn. I have always said that the most important thing is not living, but living well. Living well means living virtuously, and I cannot virtuously break the laws of the city that raised me. Crito leaves at dawn, defeated. Socrates will not be persuaded. He will not escape. He will die because he believes that philosophy requires it, that integrity requires it, that the examined life leads inevitably to this moment where he must choose between survival and consistency. We cannot know what Socrates truly thought, but what we know is that he stayed, he refused rescue, and when the ship returned from Delos, he prepared to die. The execution ritual is recorded in Plato's Phaedo. The account is detailed, vivid, and probably embellished, but it gives us the scene that would echo through Western history. Socrates, in his final hours, surrounded by friends, discoursing on the immortality of the soul. It is afternoon. The ship from Delos was sighted at dawn, entering the harbour at Piraeus. By custom, the execution must happen today before sunset. The guards have told Socrates to prepare himself. The cell is crowded. All of Socrates' closest friends have come: Crito, Simmias, Cebes, Phaedo, Apollodorus, Antisthenes, and others. They sit where they can, some on the floor, some standing. The air is warm, thick with the breath of many men in a small space. Someone has brought wine, though no one drinks much. What is there to celebrate? The sun streams through the prison windows. Xanthippe is there with their youngest son. She is weeping uncontrollably, saying the kinds of things people say when someone is dying. Socrates, this is the last time you'll talk with your friends and they with you. Socrates looks at her, and there is tenderness in his eyes, but also a kind of exhaustion. He cannot deal with emotion now. There is work to do, questions to pursue. Crito, he says gently, please take her home. Crito leads Xanthippe out. She goes reluctantly, looking back at her husband, her face streaked with tears. The boy, too young to understand, follows his mother. And then the cell is quiet except for the breathing of the men who remain. Socrates asks someone to take her home. He cannot deal with emotional display. There is work to do. The friends gather. Socrates has spent the morning composing poetry, something he never did before. He says a dream instructed him to make music, and he wonders whether philosophy is the highest music. It is characteristic of him. Even now, even facing death, he is questioning, wondering, examining. I have been thinking, Socrates says, about a recurring dream I have had throughout my life. It always says the same thing: Socrates, make music. I always interpreted this as encouragement to continue philosophy, which is the highest music. But now I wonder if the god meant something more literal. So I have been composing a hymn to Apollo and putting Aesop's fables into verse. Cebes smiles despite himself. Only you, Socrates, would spend your last morning turning fables into poetry. If the god commands it, should I not obey? Even now, especially now. They discuss the soul. Cebes and Simmias raise objections to Socrates' arguments for immortality. The conversation is rigorous, dialectical, intellectual. Socrates argues that the soul is immortal, that death is merely the separation of soul from body, that the philosopher spends his whole life preparing for death by learning to separate his soul from bodily pleasures and pains. Death is what we have been training for, Socrates says. The philosopher practices dying. We spend our lives trying to detach from physical pleasures, trying to see truth with the mind rather than the senses. Death is simply the completion of that process. Simmias objects. But what if the soul is like a harmony produced by the body? When the instrument is destroyed, the harmony ceases. The soul might be nothing more than the arrangement of the body's elements. It is a serious objection. Socrates takes it seriously. He does not dismiss it. He engages with it, asking questions, probing assumptions, building arguments. Hours pass. The light from the window shifts as the sun moves west. Only at the end does emotion intrude. Socrates bathes, so his body will not need washing after death. His sons are brought in, all three of them now, the older boys, having been summoned. He speaks with them privately in the corner of the cell. No one records what he says, but when the boys leave, they are crying, and Socrates' eyes are red. His sons are brought in, he speaks with them privately, then he sends them away. The jailer enters. He is apologetic, almost tearful. He has to do this. It is his job. Socrates comforts him. It is not your fault. You are a good man. Bring the poison. Socrates, the jailer says, his voice thick, I have overseen many executions. You are the noblest, the gentlest, the best man who has ever come here. I know you do not blame me, but I blame myself. You must not, Socrates says. You are following the law. You are doing your duty. This is not evil. It is necessary. The jailer breaks down weeping. He turns and leaves quickly, unable to compose himself. The hemlock is brought in a cup. Socrates takes it calmly. He asks if he can pour a libation to the gods. The jailer says there is only enough for the dose, no extra. Socrates nods. He prays briefly. Then he drinks. Wait, Apollodorus says, his voice breaking. Should we not delay? It is not yet sunset. You have hours still. Socrates shakes his head. What would I gain by drinking poison a little later? I would only make myself ridiculous, clinging to life when there is no more life to cling to. No, it is time. He raises the cup. His hand is steady. To the gods, he says quietly. May they guide my journey. He drinks it all in a few swallows. The cup is empty. He hands it back to the attendant. The poison works slowly. Hemlock causes progressive paralysis, moving from the extremities toward the center. The jailer instructs Socrates to walk around until his legs feel heavy, then to lie down. The poison will do its work from there. Socrates walks. His friends are openly weeping now. He rebukes them gently. He wanted to die in silence. They should be calm. He lies down. The jailer checks his feet, his legs. No sensation. The paralysis is rising. They cover him with a cloth. Apollodorus cannot contain himself any longer. He sobs loudly, his whole body shaking with grief. The sound fills the cell, echoing off the stone walls. Socrates lifts the cloth from his face. Apollodorus, what is this? I sent the women away so I could die in good order. I have heard that one should die in silence. Be quiet and be brave. Apollodorus tries to stifle his sobs. The others wipe their eyes, fighting to maintain composure. Socrates lies still. The paralysis is rising. His legs are numb, his abdomen, his chest. Breathing becomes difficult, but his mind is clear. His voice, when he speaks, is calm. His last words, according to Plato, are directed at Crito. We owe a cock to Asclepius. Pay the debt. Do not neglect it. Then he dies. Crito closes his eyes and mouth, and the friends leave the prison carrying grief that will shape philosophy for the next 2,000 years. What do those last words mean? A cock was the standard offering to Asclepius, the god of healing, typically given by those cured of illness. Is Socrates saying that death is a cure, that life is the disease and he is grateful to be healed of it? Is it ironic, a final joke about the absurdity of existence, or is it simply practical, a reminder to pay a debt? We do not know. The sentence hangs in the air, ambiguous as everything else about Socrates. What we know is this: Athens executed a man for asking questions, and in doing so, Athens made him immortal. The immediate aftermath is confusion and guilt. Socrates' friends scatter. Some leave Athens temporarily, unable to bear remaining in the city that killed their teacher. Plato withdraws to Megara. Xenophon is already in Asia, having joined a mercenary expedition years earlier. Other students remain, but they are marked. Everyone knows they were Socrates' companions. In democratic Athens, that association is now dangerous, but grief transforms into something else. Within a few years, multiple former students begin writing dialogues featuring Socrates as the main character. This becomes a literary genre, Socratic dialogues. The authors include Plato, Xenophon, Antisthenes, Aeschines, Phaedo, and others. Most of these works are lost. What survives is primarily Plato's corpus, approximately 25 dialogues spanning decades of composition. This is how Socrates becomes immortal, not through his own writing, which does not exist, not through objective historical record, which is absent, but through literary recreation, through students putting words in their dead teacher's mouth, creating a Socrates who is wiser, more consistent, more profound than any human being could actually be. Plato does this most successfully. Over the course of his writing life, Plato's Socrates evolves. The early dialogues, written closest to Socrates' death, show a figure who asks questions but gives few answers, who professes ignorance and exposes others' false certainty. This is probably closest to the historical Socrates. But in the middle and late dialogues, Plato's Socrates becomes increasingly confident, increasingly willing to propose positive doctrines. He teaches the theory of forms. He discusses the immortality of the soul in detail. He constructs elaborate metaphysical systems. Scholars debate how much of this is Socrates and how much is Plato, using his teacher as a mouthpiece for his own philosophy. The consensus is that the later dialogues are mostly Plato. The real Socrates probably did not have a worked-out metaphysics. He probably did not teach the theory of forms. He asked questions. He sought definitions. He examined lives. That was his method. Plato took that method and built an entire philosophical system on top of it. And this is what allows Socrates to become philosophy itself. Plato founds the Academy in Athens around 387 BCE, roughly 12 years after Socrates' death. The Academy becomes the first institution of higher learning in Western civilization. It lasts for 900 years. And at the center of its teaching is the dialectical method, the question and answer technique that Socrates practiced in the Agora. Plato has institutionalized his teacher's approach, turned a practice into a discipline made philosophy something that can be taught and transmitted. Other schools emerge claiming Socratic heritage. Antisthenes, another student, founds what becomes known as cynicism. The cynics take Socrates' indifference to comfort and convention and radicalize it, living in poverty and rejecting all social norms. The most famous cynic, Diogenes of Sinope, lives in a barrel and publicly masturbates to demonstrate that convention has no power over the wise man. This is an extreme version of Socratic self-sufficiency, but the cynics claim it is the true inheritance. Aristippus, yet another student, goes in the opposite direction. He founds the Cyrenaic school, which teaches that pleasure is the highest good. This too claims Socratic roots. Did not Socrates say that virtue brings happiness? If so, and if pleasure is happiness, then pursuing pleasure is pursuing virtue. So even in the immediate aftermath, there is no single Socrates. There are multiple Socrateses, each claimed by a different philosophical school, each representing a different interpretation of the master's teaching. This fragmentation is revealing. Socrates left no writings, no definitive statement of his beliefs. He left only a method and a series of questions. His students took those tools and built incompatible philosophies, but all of them agreed on one thing. Socrates was the model philosopher, the man who lived by his principles, the man who died rather than compromise, the man who showed that philosophy is not theoretical but practical, not about ideas but about life. And so the execution that was supposed to silence Socrates instead amplified him. The death that was supposed to protect Athens from dangerous philosophy instead made philosophy sacred. Athens killed Socrates, and in killing him, Athens created the archetype of the intellectual martyr, the figure who would haunt every subsequent regime that tried to suppress free thought. But we must press further. We must ask whether this narrative, powerful as it is entirely true. Because there is another story we can tell about Socrates, a story in which he is not simply a victim but also, in some sense, complicit in his own destruction. Consider what Socrates did at his trial. He had the opportunity to save himself. The jury's initial vote was close. If he had shown contrition, if he had proposed a serious penalty, if he had acknowledged that some of his associates had done terrible things, and that he bore some responsibility for their education, he might have been spared. Instead, he was defiant. He said he deserved honor, not punishment. He insulted the jury by offering a trivial fine. This can be read as principled courage, but it can also be read as arrogance, as a refusal to acknowledge that individual conscience must sometimes yield to collective judgment, as an insistence that his mission was more important than social cohesion. And this points to something troubling in Socratic philosophy. Socrates claimed to make people better, but by what standard? Better according to whom? Socrates' standard, his personal daimonion, his individual judgment about what virtue requires. He denied that he taught anyone, but this is disingenuous. He clearly influenced people. He clearly modeled a way of life. And that way of life was incompatible with citizenship as Athens understood it, because Athenian citizenship required compromise. It required accepting that you would sometimes be wrong, that the assembly's decision would override your judgment, that the good of the community might require you to do things you personally disagreed with. Democracy is government by discussion and voting, and that means no one gets their way entirely. Everyone must yield something. Socrates would not yield, or rather, he would yield only when his daimonion permitted. He was willing to die for Athens on the battlefield, but he was not willing to accept Athens' judgment about his teaching. He would obey the laws, but only those laws that met his internal standard of justice. This is not citizenship. This is conditional participation, allegiance based on personal approval. From a democratic perspective, this is profoundly dangerous. If everyone behaves like Socrates, what holds society together? If everyone appeals to personal conscience, to individual visions of justice, to private divine signs, how can collective decisions be made? Democracy requires that people accept outcomes they disagree with. It requires a willingness to be wrong, to learn, to change one's mind based on public argument rather than private intuition. Socrates taught the opposite. He taught that most people are ignorant. He taught that conventional wisdom is usually false. He taught that the unexamined life, which is to say, most people's lives, is not worth living. This is not a philosophy compatible with democracy. It is a philosophy that valorizes the exceptional individual over the mediocre many. And history shows where that leads. It leads to Critias. It leads to the 30 tyrants. It leads to the belief that the wise should rule and the ignorant should obey. Now Socrates personally rejected tyranny. He disobeyed the 30. He had no interest in political power. But his philosophy contained the seeds of anti-democratic thought. And his students, the ones who actually sought power, took those seeds and grew them into something monstrous. This is the uncomfortable truth that the traditional narrative avoids. Philosophy is not politically innocent. Ideas have consequences, and Socratic questioning, for all its nobility, undermined the shared beliefs that held Athens together. It made young aristocrats doubt the value of democracy. It gave them intellectual tools to critique popular government. It suggested that their education and ability to reason made them superior to the common people. We cannot know how Socrates would have reacted to this criticism. He wrote nothing. But we can imagine him responding, "Yes, I questioned conventional beliefs. Yes, I made people doubt received wisdom. But democracy should be able to withstand questioning. If Athenian democracy could not survive one old man asking questions, then it was weak. Truth should not be subordinated to political convenience. The unexamined life genuinely is not worth living, even if that belief is unpopular." And this is the crux. Two visions of the good life, incompatible and both compelling. Democracy says we are in this together, we must compromise, we must accept collective decisions even when we think they are wrong. Philosophy says truth matters more than consensus, justice matters more than stability, individual conscience matters more than collective authority. Athens chose democracy. Socrates died. But his death did not resolve the tension. It only made it permanent. Every subsequent conflict between individual conscience and state authority, every clash between intellectual freedom and social cohesion, every debate about whether truth should be constrained by political necessity, all of these are reenactments of Athens versus Socrates. And what makes it a tragedy rather than a simple case of good versus evil is that both sides had legitimate claims. Athens was not a tyranny. It was a democracy trying to survive. Socrates was not a saint. He was a brilliant, difficult man whose teaching had helped produce traitors. The trial was not philosophy versus ignorance. It was two goods in conflict, unable to find a way to coexist. The story does not end in 399 BCE. It continues through the centuries, transforming with each retelling. Within a generation, Socrates has become a hero to philosophers. Plato's Academy teaches that he was the wisest man who ever lived. Aristotle, Plato's student, references Socrates constantly, treating him as the founder of ethical inquiry. The Stoics, emerging in the 3rd century BCE, claim Socratic heritage through the Cynics. They teach that virtue is the only good, that external circumstances cannot harm the wise, that one should live according to reason rather than convention. This is recognizably Socratic, even though the Stoics develop it far beyond anything Socrates actually taught. By the Roman period, Socrates has become a stock figure in ethical discourse. Cicero writes about him. Seneca invokes him as a model of philosophical courage. The Emperor Marcus Aurelius meditates on Socratic themes in his private notebooks. Socrates is now not just a Greek philosopher, but a universal symbol of wisdom and virtue. Then Christianity emerges, and Christianity, surprisingly, adopts Socrates. Early Christian apologists like Justin Martyr argue that Socrates was a kind of proto-Christian, that his daimonion was actually the Holy Spirit, that his willingness to die rather than betray the truth prefigures Christ's sacrifice. This is historically absurd. Socrates was a pagan with no connection to Jewish or Christian tradition, but it works rhetorically. Christians are being persecuted by Rome. They need examples of noble pagans who suffered for their beliefs. Socrates fits perfectly. Medieval scholars continue this trend. Thomas Aquinas discusses Socratic method. Dante places Socrates in limbo, the least terrible part of hell reserved for virtuous pagans. He is alongside Homer and Aristotle, forever excluded from heaven but not punished either. He is respected, even honored, but still outside the Christian dispensation. The Renaissance rediscovers the full corpus of Platonic dialogues. Suddenly, Western intellectuals have direct access to Socratic conversations in a way that medieval scholars did not. The result is an explosion of interest. Socrates becomes a model for humanist education. Erasmus writes dialogues in imitation of Plato. Montaigne meditates on Socratic ignorance. The phrase, "I know that I know nothing," becomes proverbial, even though Socrates never said exactly that. The Enlightenment radicalizes Socrates. Voltaire portrays him as a martyr to superstition and ignorance, killed by religious fanatics who could not tolerate free inquiry. This is not quite accurate. Socrates was not an atheist, and Athens was not dominated by priests, but it serves Enlightenment purposes. The philosophers are fighting against religious authority and political absolutism. Socrates becomes their patron saint, the first victim of the forces they oppose. The 19th century brings new interpretations. Hegel reads Socrates as a tragic figure representing the conflict between individual subjectivity and social substance. Kierkegaard sees Socrates as exemplifying ironic existence, the refusal to commit to any final position. Nietzsche characteristically attacks Socrates. He argues that Socrates represents the triumph of rationality over instinct, the beginning of Western civilization's sickness. Socrates made Greeks overthink. He introduced the poison of logical analysis where once there was healthy, unreflective life. The 20th century continues the multiplication of Socrateses. Karl Popper, in The Open Society and Its Enemies, defends Socrates against charges that his philosophy led to totalitarianism. I.F. Stone, writing in 1988, makes the opposite argument. Stone's The Trial of Socrates claims that Socrates was genuinely anti-democratic and that Athens had good reason to convict him. The trial was not a simple case of martyrdom, but a complex political act in a society trying to rebuild after civil war. And so we arrive at the present, where Socrates has become almost infinitely malleable. He is invoked by free speech advocates as the philosopher who died for his right to speak. He is invoked by religious believers as a man of faith persecuted by secularists. He is invoked by educators as the inventor of critical thinking. He is invoked by activists as someone who refused to obey unjust laws. All of these uses contain truth. None of them is complete. Because Socrates wrote nothing, because we have only contested accounts of his life, he can be made to stand for almost anything. He is the blank screen onto which every age projects its values. But if we strip away the projections, if we return to the historical moment as best we can reconstruct it, what do we find? We find a man who spent his life asking questions that made powerful people uncomfortable. We find a city that tried to tolerate him until it decided it could not. We find a trial that was both legally proper and morally troubling. We find an execution that achieved the opposite of its intention, making the victim immortal and the executioners infamous. And we find a question that remains unresolved. How should a society balance intellectual freedom against social cohesion? When does questioning become corrosive? When does stability become repression? Where is the line between the gadfly Athens needed and the threat Athens could not tolerate? These are not ancient questions. They are present questions. Every society faces them. Every democracy must decide how much dissent it can absorb. Every individual must decide how much to compromise for the sake of community. Socrates gave one answer: never compromise on truth. Accept death rather than accept falsehood. The examined life is the only life worth living. Athens gave another answer: the community comes first. The individual must yield to the collective. Survival requires unity, and unity requires limiting those who would tear us apart. Both answers are rational, both are defensible. And that is why the trial of Socrates matters 24 centuries later. Not because it provides answers, but because it poses the question so starkly that we cannot avoid it. What Socrates did not know, could not have known, is that his death would become philosophy's founding myth, that every subsequent philosopher would define themselves in relation to him, that the question of what philosophy is for would always return to that prison cell in Athens, to those final conversations about the soul, to that cup of hemlock drunk calmly while friends wept. Did Socrates die for truth? Or did he die because his truth was incompatible with the city that raised him? The question assumes these are different. Perhaps they are the same. Perhaps the examined life and the political life are fundamentally at odds. Perhaps philosophy and citizenship are incompatible goods, and all we can do is manage the tension rather than resolve it. This is not the triumphalist story we usually tell. We prefer the narrative where Athens was wrong and Socrates was right, where democracy failed and philosophy triumphed. But history is messier than that. Athens was not a tyranny. It was the most free, most creative, most intellectually vibrant city of its time. And even Athens, even this democracy that produced Sophocles and Herodotus and the Parthenon, even Athens could not tolerate Socrates. What does that tell us? It tells us that democracy is fragile. It tells us that even free societies have limits. It tells us that intellectual freedom and social stability exist in permanent tension, and that sometimes that tension becomes unsustainable. But it also tells us something else. It tells us that ideas cannot be killed. Athens executed Socrates, but Socratic questioning survived. The dialectical method survived. The commitment to examining life survived. Plato founded the academy. Aristotle systematized logic. The Stoics developed ethics. Christianity absorbed philosophical categories. The Enlightenment championed reason. Modernity built universities where Socratic dialogue is still practiced. Athens killed the man, but the man became immortal precisely because he was killed. His death proved what his life had argued, that there are things more important than survival, that truth matters more than comfort, that the unexamined life genuinely is not worth living. And so Socrates remains permanent and unresolved, asking questions no one can finally answer. What is justice? What is virtue? How should we live? What do we owe the city? What do we owe the truth? He stands in that prison cell forever, surrounded by grieving friends, about to drink poison, still asking, still questioning, still refusing to accept easy answers. He is philosophy itself, not as a body of doctrine, but as an activity, a practice, a commitment to keep examining even when examination is dangerous. Athens wanted him to stop. He would not stop. So Athens killed him. And in killing him, Athens made him eternal. The trial of Socrates is not over. It continues in every classroom where a teacher asks a question instead of providing an answer. It continues in every courtroom where individual conscience confronts state authority. It continues in every conversation where someone dares to say, "I do not understand, explain further." It continues because the question Socrates asked, "How should we live?" has never been settled. Every generation must answer it anew, and every generation that tries to answer it honestly, that refuses inherited wisdom without examination, that values truth over convenience, is in some sense Socratic. This is why we remember him, not because he had all the answers. He claimed to have none, but because he had the courage to keep asking and the integrity to die rather than stop. Athens could not tolerate that. No city, ultimately, can tolerate it completely. The gadfly irritates even when it serves a purpose. The questioner annoys even when the questions are necessary. Society requires that most of us, most of the time, accept without examining, trust without verifying, obey without questioning. But it also requires that some of us sometimes do the opposite, that some of us ask the questions no one wants asked, that some of us examine the unexamined, that some of us refuse to accept authority without justification. Socrates was that person, and Athens was the city that could not decide whether to honor him or destroy him. In the end, it chose destruction, but the destruction was incomplete, because what Socrates represented, the examined life, the questioning mind, the commitment to truth over comfort, cannot be destroyed. It can only be suppressed temporarily. And when it returns, as it always does, it carries the memory of that old man in that prison cell, drinking poison rather than compromise. He is still there, still asking, still waiting for an answer that will never come, still demonstrating that some questions are more important than answers, that some pursuits are more important than success, that some lives, examined, difficult, dangerous lives, are worth living even when they end in hemlock. The trial of Socrates is complete. The verdict was death. The sentence was carried out. But the question he died asking remains. And as long as that question remains, Socrates is not dead. He is asking it still in every person who refuses to live unexamined, in every voice that speaks truth to power, in every mind that questions what everyone else accepts. Athens executed philosophy, but philosophy survived, and in surviving it won, not completely, not finally, but permanently. Because now we know what Athens learned, too late, that you cannot kill an idea by killing the person who speaks it. You can only make that person immortal and the idea invincible. Socrates knew this, or if he did not know it, he intuited it. He saw that his death would mean more than his life. He saw that martyrdom would accomplish what argument could not. He saw that Athens, in trying to silence him, would amplify him across centuries, and so he drank the hemlock calmly. He comforted his friends, he paid his debt to Asclepius, and he died, leaving us with the question that defines philosophy, that defines humanity, that defines what it means to live consciously in the world. How should we live? He asked it in Athens in 399 BCE. We ask it still, and as long as we ask it, Socrates has not died. He lives in the question, and the question will outlive us all.